The two ladies in waiting on the Empress came out of her apartment, and at the very moment when I came into theirs, my 2 weeks beard, the state of my clothes, my fur-lined boots, all this, I imagined, struck them as unfavorably as it had the porter, for I had to repeat the good news of the Emperor's arrival over and over before I could stop their fleeing from the ghost they thought they saw. Finally, the Emperor's name reassured them and helped them to recognize me. One of them announced me to the Empress. Meanwhile, the Emperor, who had scarcely been able to hide his impatience, brought my errand to an end by coming into the Empress's apartment and saying to me, "Good night, Caulaincourt. You need some rest too." I went immediately to the Arch-Chancellor's, as the Emperor instructed me to do. The Prince had little thought that the dispatch he sent off by the evening post would reach its destination so quickly. If I had not come by the post chaise, if a footman in the palace livery had not come with me, and the postilion uniform had not been my passport, I should have had trouble again in being admitted to the Arch-Chancellor's. I could have got nowhere on my looks. The court footman had more or less to stand sponsor for me, for the Prince's servants looked me over and did not know for sure what to make of this figure that none of them recognized or would announce. Monsieur Joubert of the bank and a number of the others who were in the Prince's salon stood as though petrified at this apparition. Everyone looked at me without saying a word. None knew what to make either of my arrival or this figure that seemed not fit, the name which had been announced. After the first impression produced my attire and my beard, the same thought came to them all. Where is the Emperor? What is the news? Can something have happened to him? That was what everybody said without being able to utter a word. The terrible bulletin had come out. None had awakened that morning with pleasant impressions. They felt glum. None knew the Emperor was in Paris. Why was the Master of Horse there? Why had he left the Emperor? The hour, the pale lamplight, the uncertainties that had been so, the melancholy details they had learned and those for which they were waiting, all this filled their minds with gloom and inclined them to sad forebodings. Such was the state of those in the salon, while I stood there waiting for the footman to return from announcing me in the Prince's study. That dumb show cannot be described. All stared at me without the power to speak. They seemed to be holding their breath. Each tried to read his own sentence in my glance, and the expression of all their faces betrayed more fear than hope. I had spoken to Monsieur Joubert. When his first astonishment had worn off, he exclaimed, "And the Emperor, Your Grace?" He could not finish his question. Each repeated those words with an air of dismay. "And the Emperor? Where is he?" "In Paris," I answered. At that, all their faces brightened up, and I went in to see the Prince. He greeted me with the same exclamation, which I broke in upon to give him reassurance. I conveyed the Emperor's orders, chatted a few minutes, and enjoined upon him to have the cannon announce the Emperor's return at dawn. He was also to advise the ministers in the court that levee would be held at 11 o'clock, and so on. On reaching my quarters, I ordered that a page be sent to Madame Mère and to each of the princesses at 8 in the morning to announce the Emperor's arrival to them. I wrote to Lord Chamberlain concerning the palace staff. On the morrow, December 19th, the Emperor ordered me to take over the portfolio of foreign affairs during the Duke of Bassano's absence and to bring him certain parts of the Viennese correspondence, together with the latest treaties with Austria and Prussia. I was wearied from the 14 nights I had spent on the qui-vive without a wink of sleep and in a measure depressed by the sense of responsibilities that such a journey made under such circumstances had heaped upon me. Apart from that, moreover, I had been heavily preoccupied lest something happened to the Emperor, who had entrusted himself to my care and good faith. All these recent impressions had induced such a state of nervous exhaustion that I needed some repose. I therefore requested the Emperor to excuse me from this task and to turn it over to Monsieur de la Bernardière. He acceded. At 11 o'clock, I was at the Tuileries for the levee. The ministers and many of the household officials, the chamberlains in particular, were at hand. They crowded around, made much of me, as though I had been a favorite, as though I were a man of influence who had just spent 14 nights and as many days tete-a-tete with authority. The dreadful bulletin had appeared in the Moniteur on the 16th. We had had word of that from the last dispatch we met along the way. It had produced so strong an impression, even upon the most subservient, that they too sought to read from my expressions some news of their dear ones. None dared to ask me for it. The bulletin alone had arrived. Not one private letter had been given out. I had the satisfaction of setting many people's minds at rest, but there were, alas, many whom I saddened, even though after Malo Jaroslavets, the army had been so disordered and strung out that the general staff was unable to give reports about many officers, even of the highest rank. They, unhorsed and in total want, had to seek their subsistence by following the gangs that ranged along the flanks of the column, now towards the head and now towards the rear. The most resolute were reduced to this cruel necessity for a whole handful of gold. Even before the Barricino would not have procured a crust of bread. I returned to the attendance chamber before concluding what relates to the campaign and the emperor's journey. As I was saying, the bulletin had produced so woeful a sensation that none dared question me. The lone servant, Rustam, who had accompanied us, was sleeping and had been forbidden, besides, to tell anything in his conversation. The emperor spoke out as frankly about our reverses as the bulletin had done, and yet, however, no news could be had of the army's arrival at Vilna, and consequently he, like everyone else, knew nothing of the worst disasters. His legs were a little bloated, his eyes were puffy, and he had the hue of one whose skin has been tanned by the cold. Otherwise, he appeared to be in good health. He was so happy to find himself in Paris that he did not need to compose his countenance in order to appear satisfied and not at all downcast. He worked the whole day and even part of the night, sending out orders and imparting to all branches of administration the impulses which he wished them to have. He seemed to me well content with the state of opinion and of public spirit since the printing of the bulletin. His arrival had calmed many fears and allayed the great anxieties, though unhappily without drying the tears of families that had losses to weep for. The emperor spoke of his disasters, of the mistake he had made by staying at Moscow, as a stranger might have done. The venture failed. By a week's time, he said, everything in the world depends on that. The right moment, timeliness, those are everything. In receiving Monsieur de Cray's and Cazac, his first words were, well, well, gentlemen, fortune dazzled me. I let myself be carried away. Instead of following the plan I had made, and that I spoke of to you, Monsieur Cazac, I have been to Moscow. I thought to sign peace there. I stayed there too long. I had thought to gain in a year what only 2 campaigns could achieve. I have made a great blunder, but I shall have the means to retrieve it. From the very first, the complexion of Paris had looked cheering to him. His return had produced a tremendous effect. The emperor sensed as much, and after the second day, he felt reassured about the consequences that his losses might entail. The losses at Vilna did not alter his opinion. The terrible bulletin has had its effect, he said to me, but I see that my presence is giving them more pleasure than our disastrous campaign. There's more affliction than discouragement. This state of mind will communicate itself to Vienna, and all will be retrieved within 3 months. If I have omitted many things from the details here given of the conversations I had with the emperor during our long tete-a-tete, I can at least guarantee the accuracy, for the most part down even to the very words of what I do record. Neither conscience nor memory has played me false. I had long been in the habit of telling the emperor candidly what I thought without fear of offending him, and I owe it to him to declare that during this journey he more often requested me to speak out boldly than to mind what I was saying. He encouraged me especially by the frankness of his discourse and of his confidences. He proved to me what I had already believed, that he did not always love the plain truth, but that he esteemed those who spoke it plainly. Under other circumstances, if the conversation touched on a matter he would not discuss, he broke it off somehow or other. If he were at home, he would leave or dismiss you, or would interrupt with an order foreign to the subject at hand. Sometimes, too, he would say, you know nothing about that. In the sledge, on the contrary, he always prompted. Did he feel himself hurt? He joked about it. More than anything, he showed the need of unburdening himself. If certain topics were too displeasing to him, he would change the subject momentarily. But that day or the next, he would revert to the same question. I venture to assert that during this journey, the emperor was kind enough to hear me without taking offense. And I say once again that I was able to convince myself from the nature and frankness of his conversation that one could lay many claims to his confidence who could lay none to his favor.